Abruptly, the clinking of heavy silver cutlery ceased. Drawn to the far end of the mahogany table, 14 pairs of eyes locked onto the governess in her fraying grey dress. With a thin, bloodless stretching of lips, the Duchess of Roxbury delivered the final, humiliating insult. Desperate for the floor to open and swallow her, Clara lowered her gaze. The wood beneath her feet, however, stubbornly refused to give way. Breaking the oppressive silence, a heavy chair scraped against the floorboards as the Duke rose to his feet. The nursery at Roxbury Hall was always cold. It didn't matter how much coal the scullery maids hauled up the 3 flights of narrow, twisting stairs. The dampness of the Yorkshire moors had seeped into the very marrow of the stone walls. Clara Linfield sat by the meagre fire, holding a needle to the failing light of the afternoon sun. It was mending a tear in a linen shirt belonging to Lord Thomas, the youngest and most feral of the Duchess of Roxbury's 3 nephews. Clara's fingers were stiff, the knuckles red and raw. She breathed on them, a small puff of white vapour in the draughty room, and pushed the needle through the fabric again. She was 24. To the world below the stairs, she was an invisible necessity. To the family above, she was a piece of furniture that occasionally spoke French. Clara had not been born to servitude. Her father had been a scholar of antiquities, a man whose love for ancient Greek texts far outstripped his understanding of modern ledgers. When he died suddenly of a winter fever, he left Clara with an encyclopedic knowledge of Homer, a refined accent, and a mountain of debt. The creditors took the house. They took the books. They took the velvet armchairs and the silver tea service. Clara took a carriage to Yorkshire to teach other people's children how to hold a pen. She survived by becoming unnoticeable. She wore drab colours, muddy browns, slate greys, washed-out navies. She kept her voice low. She learned to stand in the corner of a grand room and erase her own presence entirely. It was a survival tactic. The aristocracy did not like to be reminded that the people serving them had thoughts, feelings, or histories. The heavy oak door of the nursery swung open. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, stepped in. She didn't knock. Housekeepers never knocked for governesses. "Miss Linfield," Mrs. Gable said, her voice tight with stress. She carried a scent of beeswax and panic. "You are required downstairs." Clara didn't look up from the shirt. "The children are currently taking their rest, Mrs. Gable. I am not scheduled to bring them down until after the tea service." "Not the children. You!" Mrs. Gable wrung her hands, a rare display of agitation. "Lord Harrington's carriage lost a wheel in the mud near the village. He will not make it tonight. We have a table set for 14, and without him, there are 13. Clara stopped sewing. Her needle hung suspended in the air. 13. The Duchess of Roxbury, Henrietta, was violently superstitious. 13 at a dinner table meant a death in the family within the year. It was a silly provincial fear, but the wealthy clung to their eccentricities like jewels. "Surely there is a neighbouring squire," Clara said cautiously. "There is no time. The first course is to be served in 2 hours. Her Grace demands you fill the seat." Mrs. Gable looked Clara up and down, her eyes catching on the frayed cuffs of Clara's plain wool bodice. Her nose wrinkled in faint distaste. "Do you have anything respectable to wear? Something that does not look as though you've spent the afternoon crawling through the soot?" "I have my Sunday silk," Clara said. It was a generous description. The dress was dark grey, 5 years out of fashion, and the silk was beginning to thin at the elbows. But it was clean. "Wear it," Mrs. Gable ordered. "You will sit at the very foot of the table near the kitchens. You will use the outermost forks first. You will not initiate conversation. You will not laugh loudly. If you are spoken to, answer briefly. You are there to be a body occupying a chair, Miss Linfield. Nothing more." "I understand," Clara said. Her voice was flat, betraying none of the cold dread pooling in her stomach. 2 hours later, Clara stood in front of the small, clouded mirror in her bedchamber. The grey silk dress was tight across the ribs. She had used a drop of writing ink to carefully paint over a patch of frayed white, threading at the hem, hoping the dim lighting of the dining room would hide the deception. She pulled her dark hair back into a severe, unyielding knot at the nape of her neck. No loose curls, no vanity. She stared at her reflection. Her skin was pale, her grey eyes tired. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman standing on the edge of a world that would happily push her over. Taking a slow, steadying breath, Clara left the freezing nursery and began the long descent down the servants' stairs toward the warmth, the noise, and the danger of the dining room. The dining room of Roxbury Hall was an exercise in calculated intimidation. The ceiling was vaulted, painted with faded frescoes of Greek gods. A massive fireplace roared at one side of the room, throwing aggressive heat across the polished floorboards. The dining table was a monstrous slab of mahogany, running 20 feet down the center, covered in a pristine expanse of white damask linen. Crystal glasses caught the light of 100 beeswax candles. Silver platters gleamed. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant, heavy red wine, and the cloying, musky perfumes of the women. Clara stood by the doorway, a ghost in grey silk, waiting for the guests to take their seats. They drifted in, a parade of silk, satin, and inherited arrogance. Henrietta, the Duchess of Roxbury, led them. She was a tall woman, painfully thin, with a face like a hatchet. She wore emerald green velvet and a diamond necklace that could have paid off Clara's father's debts 10 times over. Henrietta didn't look at Clara. She merely flicked 2 fingers toward the far end of the table. Clara walked to the designated chair. It was the lowest seat, positioned right where the drafts from the serving doors hit hardest. She sat down, tucking her hands neatly into her lap. The room was loud. The guests laughed at inside jokes, gossiped about people Clara had never met, and debated the merits of thoroughbred horses. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the rim of her empty plate. 10 minutes into the soup course, the double doors at the head of the room opened. The conversation died instantly. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, stepped into the room. He was not a man who moved with the fluid grace of the idle rich. He walked with a heavy, uneven tread, leaning slightly on a silver-tipped cane. A riding accident years ago. The staff whispered. Or perhaps the war. Clara didn't know. She only knew he possessed a fortune vast enough to buy the county, and a reputation for utter, ruthless pragmatism. He was in his late 30s. His dark hair was brushed back, threading with early silver at the temples. His face was angular, hard, and deeply weary. He looked at the assembled guests the way a man looks at a mild infestation of insects. "Arthur," Henrietta cooed, her shrill voice slicing through the sudden silence. "We feared you were waylaid. My carriage axle broke," Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying effortlessly down the long table. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't smile. He walked to the empty chair at Henrietta's right, the seat of honor. He sat down, placing his cane against the table leg. A footman immediately materialized to pour his wine. Henrietta leaned in, her eyes gleaming. Beside her sat Cecily, Henrietta's niece, a young woman with ringlets and a terrifyingly blank smile. Henrietta had been trying to shove Cecily into the Duke's bed for 2 seasons. The dinner resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. The guests were performing now. They spoke louder, laughed harder, desperate to draw the Duke's attention. Arthur ate his soup in silence, occasionally offering a single, monosyllabic response to Cecily's breathless chatter. Clara watched him from the far end. He looked bored. He looked angry. By the time the 3rd course, a heavy venison stew, was cleared, Henrietta was growing frustrated. Arthur was ignoring Cecily. He was ignoring Henrietta's attempts at political debate. He sat there, an impenetrable wall of dark wool and indifference. Henrietta needed a spectacle. She needed to entertain him. Her eyes swept the table, hunting. They bypassed the lords, bypassed the wealthy widows, and landed on the far end. They landed on Clara. Clara felt the shift in the Duchess's gaze like a physical blow. She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Tell me, Miss Linfield." Henrietta called out. The volume of her voice was deliberate. It was designed to halt the surrounding conversations. One by one, the guests stopped talking. Faces turned down the long expanse of mahogany. 14 pairs of eyes settled on the governess in the frayed grey dress. Clara placed her fork down silently. "Yes, Your Grace." Henrietta rested her elbows on the table, a predatory tilt to her head. "I was just recalling a conversation I had with Lady Bertram about the middle classes, about their utter lack of financial discipline." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands, hidden beneath the tablecloth, clamped together so tightly her fingernails dug into her own skin. "Your father was a scholar, was he not?" Henrietta asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "He was, Your Grace." Clara said, "Keep it brief, be wallpaper." And yet, despite all his grand learning, he died completely ruined. Henrietta smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. It was the look of a dog about to snap a rabbit's neck. "It always fascinates me. How does a man with so many books fail to comprehend simple arithmetic? I suppose reading Homer doesn't put bread on the table, or keep the bailiffs from tossing one onto the street." A low titter of laughter rippled through the guests. A few of the men smirked. Cecily giggled into her napkin. Clara's ears began to ring. The heat from the fireplace suddenly felt suffocating. She looked at the Duchess, at the cool, glittering eyes. The humiliation was absolute. It was designed not just to mock her poverty, but to remind every person in the room that Clara was less than them. An object of pity and disgust. Clara opened her mouth. She wanted to say that her father had bought books to preserve history. She wanted to say he was a gentle man who had trusted the wrong bankers. But the words wouldn't come. If she defended him, she would be dismissed tomorrow without a reference. She would starve. So she swallowed her father's memory. She lowered her head, staring at the white linen. "I cannot say, Your Grace." Clara whispered. "Speak up, girl," Henrietta snapped. "We cannot hear you." Clara closed her eyes. "I cannot say, Your Grace." Henrietta leaned back, satisfied. She turned toward Arthur, expecting him to share in the amusement of the kill. It is a tragedy, really. The lower classes simply lack the moral constitution for money management. Don't you agree, Arthur? The dining room waited for the Duke's verdict. Arthur did not look at Henrietta. He did not look at Cecily. His dark, heavy gaze was fixed dead ahead, locked on the small, trembling figure in grey silk at the far end of the table. Arthur Pendleton hated society dinners. He hated the smell of heavy perfume trying to mask the scent of rot. He hated the simpering smiles, the calculated gossip, the endless, exhausting posturing of people who had never done a hard day's work in their miserable lives. He had spent 3 years fighting in the peninsula. He had seen boys bleed to death in the mud for a country that didn't know their names. When he returned, shattered in the leg and heavy in the soul, he found that the aristocracy was exactly as he left it. Cruel, vain, and entirely pointless. He had been ignoring Henrietta all evening. He knew what she wanted. She wanted him to marry the vapid girl beside him. She wanted access to his vaults. He had been planning to leave the moment the port was served. Then he heard the shift in Henrietta's tone, the high, sharp note of a woman preparing to draw blood. He had watched the governess when she first sat down. He noticed her, because she was the only real thing in the room. She wore no jewels. Her dress was old, meticulously patched. She sat with her spine rigid, her eyes cast down, vibrating with the quiet, desperate tension of a hunted animal trying to blend into the brush. He listened as Henrietta tore into the girl's dead father. He watched the girl's knuckles turn white beneath the table. He saw the violent, sickening flush of shame crawl up her pale neck. He waited for someone to intervene. A man of honor, a woman of grace. No one did. They laughed. Arthur felt a cold, familiar rage uncoil in his chest. It was the same rage he felt when he saw an officer strike a wounded private. It was a disgust so profound it tasted like copper in his mouth. Henrietta was looking at him now. "Don't you agree, Arthur?" Arthur slowly reached up and unbuttoned his dark wool jacket. He picked up his heavy linen napkin, wiped his mouth with slow, deliberate precision, and dropped the cloth onto his plate. The silver fork hit the porcelain. A sharp, singular clink. The laughter died. The room went dead silent. Arthur did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I find myself suddenly intolerant of drafts, Henrietta." Henrietta blinked, confused by the non sequitur. "Drafts, Your Grace. I can have the servants stoke the fire." "No." Arthur pushed his chair back. The heavy wood scraped against the floorboards, a loud, ugly sound that made Cecily flinch. He stood up. He reached for his silver-tipped cane. "Your Grace?" Henrietta's voice wavered. Arthur ignored her. He gripped his cane and began to walk. His limp was pronounced tonight, his heavy boots striking the floor in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Step, thump, step, thump. Every head turned. The footmen plastered themselves against the walls. Arthur walked past the Earl of Sussex. He walked past Lady Bertram. He walked the entire 20-foot length of the mahogany table. He stopped at the very end, towering over the small chair where Clara sat. Clara didn't look up. She couldn't. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. She stared at the polished black leather of the Duke's boots, her breath trapped in her throat. Was he going to order her to leave? Was he going to add to the mockery? Arthur turned his head, looking back up the length of the table toward the Duchess. "Miss Linfield," Arthur said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone. It wasn't harsh, but it commanded absolute obedience. Clara forced her head up. She looked into his face. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were dark, intense, and completely sober. "The draft by this door is offensive," Arthur said, his voice carrying effortlessly to Henrietta's ears. "And the conversation at the head of this table lacks substance." Henrietta inhaled sharply. A collective gasp rippled through the lords and ladies. Arthur gestured with his free hand toward the other end of the room. "Come sit beside me." Clara froze. Her mind blanked entirely. She looked at him, then looked frantically up the table. Henrietta's face had gone a mottled, ugly purple. Cecily looked as though she had been struck by lightning. "Your Grace," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. I cannot. My place is here." "Your place, Miss Linfield, is wherever I ask you to be." Arthur didn't move. He held her gaze, dropping his voice so only she could hear. "Do not let them break you. Stand up." It was not a plea. It was a lifeline. Clara looked at his outstretched hand. She looked at the terrifying gauntlet of the dining table. Then she thought of her father. She thought of the cold nursery, the frayed silk, the years of swallowing her pride like broken glass. Clara placed her hands on the table and pushed herself up. She did not take his arm. That would be a bridge too far. But she stepped out from behind the chair. Arthur nodded once, a sharp incline of his head. He turned and began the walk back up the table. Clara followed him. The silence in the room was absolute. It was thick enough to choke on. The rustle of Clara's grey silk skirt sounded like a roaring wind. She felt the burning stares of 14 aristocrats, but she didn't lower her eyes this time. She kept her gaze fixed on the broad, dark shoulders of the Duke walking ahead of her. They reached the head of the table. Cecily was sitting in the chair to the right. The chair to the left was empty, reserved for the late Lord Harrington. Arthur did not gesture to the empty chair. Instead, he stopped beside his own chair, at the very head of the table. He looked at a footman trembling by the sideboard. "Bring another chair," Arthur commanded. "Place it here, at my right." Henrietta sputtered. "Arthur, Cecily is on your right. There is no room." "Make room," Arthur said coldly. He didn't even look at the Duchess. The footman practically sprinted to grab a heavy carved dining chair from the wall. He squeezed it between Arthur's seat and Cecily's. Cecily had to awkwardly pull her skirts in to avoid being crushed. Arthur stood by the newly placed chair. He looked at Clara. Clara stepped forward and sat down. Arthur took his own seat. The power dynamic of the room had shattered and reformed in the span of 3 minutes. The invisible governess was now seated at the apex of the table, flanked by the most powerful man in the county. A footman hurried forward with a bottle of wine, reaching to pour it into Clara's empty glass. Arthur raised a hand, stopping the servant. "Leave it." The footman bowed and scurried away. Arthur took the heavy crystal decanter himself. He poured the dark red wine into Clara's glass. It was an incredibly intimate, deeply shocking gesture. Dukes did not serve governesses. Dukes did not serve anyone. He set the decanter down. He picked up his own glass and turned slightly toward Clara, his broad back now creating a physical wall between her and Henrietta. "Tell me, Miss Linfield," Arthur said, his voice calm, conversational, entirely ignoring the gaping audience around them. "Which of Homer's works did your father favor, the Iliad or the Odyssey?" Clara looked at the dark, red wine in her glass. She looked at the man beside her. The panic in her chest began to recede, replaced by a strange, fierce warmth. She looked up, meeting his eyes evenly. "The Iliad, Your Grace," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. He believed that anger, when directed properly, could change the course of history. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of Arthur's mouth. "A wise man," the Duke said. He raised his glass to her, and the Duchess of Roxbury watched in silent, helpless fury as the governess took a sip of her wine. The remainder of the dinner was an agonizing exercise in endurance for the Duke's fellow guests. The natural order of their world had been ruptured, and they did not know how to stitch it back together. Clara ate her roasted pheasant. She tasted nothing. Her heart was beating a frantic, exhausting rhythm against her ribs. She was acutely aware of the space between her arm and Arthur's. It was merely inches. She could feel the heat radiating from his dark wool coat. She could smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and cold air that clung to him, entirely overpowering the heavy perfumes of the women across the table. Arthur did not attempt to bring the rest of the table into their conversation. He spoke exclusively to Clara, his voice pitched low, forcing her to lean in slightly to hear him over the terrified, hushed murmurs of the other guests. "Your father translated the Greek himself?" Arthur asked, cutting his meat with steady, mechanical precision. "Yes, Your Grace. He believed the standard English translations stripped the text of its brutality. He used to say that Homer was not writing poetry for gentlemen. He was writing war for soldiers." Arthur stopped chewing. He looked at his plate for a long moment, the silver fork resting in his large, scarred hand. "War for soldiers," he repeated softly. The words seemed to echo in a hollow place inside him. And did his translation capture it? "It captured the dirt, Your Grace, and the exhaustion. I believe those were the elements he found most authentic. Arthur finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was a raw, unvarnished understanding there that made Clara's breath hitch. He did not look at her like a duke examining a servant. He looked at her like a man recognizing a fellow survivor. To their left, Cecily was practically vibrating with misery. She had spent 2 hours curling her hair for this evening, and the Duke of Westford had not looked at her once since ordering her to shrink in her seat. Henrietta, seated opposite Arthur, was attempting to maintain a facade of aristocratic boredom, but the tight white lines around her mouth betrayed a murderous fury. When the final course of spun sugar and preserved fruits was cleared, Henrietta stood. It was the signal for the ladies to withdraw to the drawing-room, leaving the men to their port, their cigars, and their politics. Clara stood up. The temporary sanctuary of the Duke's presence evaporated. She was about to be thrown into a room with 13 wealthy women who had just watched a governess usurp their social apex. Arthur did not stand, but he shifted in his chair, looking up at her. "I expect I shall not see you in the drawing-room, Miss Linfield." "No, Your Grace," Clara said, her voice dropping back into its customary quietness. "My duties in the nursery begin at dawn." "A pity." Arthur reached for his glass of port. "The conversation will undoubtedly suffer in your absence." He said it loudly enough for Henrietta to hear. The Duchess stiffened, her spine rigid with offence, before she marched out of the dining doors. Clara followed at the rear of the procession. The walk down the long, mirrored hallway to the drawing-room felt like a march to the gallows. When the heavy double doors clicked shut behind the last lady, the silence was immediate and hostile. Henrietta turned. She didn't scream. Screaming was for fishwives. Instead, she looked at Clara with a gaze so entirely devoid of humanity it made Clara's blood run cold. "You will not sit," Henrietta said. Her voice was a razor blade slipping over silk. "You will stand in that corner. You will not look at anyone. You will not speak. And when the gentlemen arrive, you will slip out the servants' door like the rodent you are." Clara walked to the shadowed corner by the heavy velvet drapes. She folded her hands in front of her. She looked at the floorboards. For an hour she stood there. Her back ached. Her feet throbbed in her thin, worn shoes. The women drank tea and ignored her with practiced cruelty. They spoke loudly of the Duke's infamous eccentricities, his battlefield trauma, his lack of refined manners, blaming his behavior entirely on a mind broken by war. They rationalized his attention to Clara as an act of madness, an insult directed at Henrietta rather than an elevation of the governess. It was easier for them to believe the Duke was insane than to believe Clara was worthy of his time. When the sound of heavy male footsteps echoed in the hall, Clara did not wait. She turned, pressed the latch on the concealed servant's door, and slipped into the pitch-black corridor behind the walls. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs in the dark, her hand trailing along the freezing plaster. When she finally reached her small, windowless bedroom off the nursery, she didn't light a candle. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot, wrapped her arms around her chest, and finally allowed herself to shake. She had won a battle of wits at a dinner table, but she was going to lose her livelihood. The frost on the windowpane was thick enough to scrape off with a fingernail. Clara awoke before the sun. Her breath plumed in the freezing air of her room. She didn't wait for the summons. She pulled her battered leather trunk from beneath the bed and opened it. She had very little to pack. 3 plain woolen dresses, a spare pair of stockings, a worn brush, and at the bottom, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, her father's last remaining ledger and a single volume of his Greek translations. She folded her clothes with meticulous care. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. If she let the terror of impending starvation take hold of her, her hands would tremble, and she needed steady hands to secure the frayed leather straps of her trunk. By the time the nursery maid came up with the morning gruel, Clara was dressed in her heaviest travelling cloak. "Mrs. Gable wants you," the young maid whispered, her eyes wide with nervous excitement. The entire servants' hall knew what had happened last night. "In the Duchess's study, right now." Clara nodded. She picked up her trunk by its single remaining handle. It was heavy, but she would not leave it for a footman to sneer at. She carried it down the narrow stairs, the leather banging against her calves with every step, a dull, bruising rhythm. She left the trunk by the kitchen door and walked to the Duchess's study on the ground floor. Henrietta was seated behind a delicate, mahogany writing desk. She was dressed in morning silk, holding a silver pen. She did not look up when Clara entered. "You are dismissed," Henrietta said. She dipped her pen into the inkwell, her movements slow and deliberate. "Effective immediately." "I understand, Your Grace," Clara said evenly. Henrietta finally raised her eyes. She looked disappointed by Clara's lack of tears. She opened a small drawer and pulled out a few coins, sliding them across the polished wood. "Here is your pay for the half-quarter. I have deducted 3 shillings for the wear on the sheets you have used, and a further 5 for the sheer insolence of your behaviour last evening. You will not receive a character reference. If anyone inquires as to why you left Roxbury Hall, I shall inform them you were caught stealing from the pantries." Clara stared at the meagre pile of copper and silver. It was barely enough to pay for a coach ticket to York, let alone lodging when she arrived. Without a reference, she could not teach. Without teaching, there was only the workhouse, or the streets. The cruelty was so complete, so neatly executed, it left no room for argument. Clara stepped forward. She picked up the coins. They were cold against her palm. "Thank you for the opportunity to serve, Your Grace," Henrietta sneered. "Get out of my house. Walk to the village. The sight of you offends me." Clara turned and walked out. She did not run. She kept her spine perfectly straight. She walked through the grand halls, down into the kitchens, picked up her heavy trunk, and pushed through the heavy oak door into the biting winter morning. The air was brutal. A freezing wind whipped across the Yorkshire moors, biting through Clara's thin cloak instantly. She shifted the trunk to her other hand and began the long 2-mile walk down the gravel drive towards the village. The gravel crunched loudly beneath her boots. Her fingers were already turning numb. She focused on the rhythm of her steps. Left, right. Breathe. Left, right. Breathe. She refused to cry. Tears would freeze on her face. She was halfway down the immense, tree-lined avenue when she heard the sound of wheels. She stepped off the gravel onto the frosted grass, expecting a tradesman's cart to pass. Instead, a massive, uncrested black carriage rounded the bend, drawn by 4 immense grey geldings. It was moving fast, the horses breathing heavy plumes of steam into the frozen air. As it neared Clara, the driver hauled back on the reins. The carriage skidded to a halt on the gravel, the wheels throwing up a spray of dirt. The door was thrown open. Arthur stepped out. He wore a heavy wool driving coat, the collar turned up against the wind. He didn't bother with the carriage steps. He dropped down onto the gravel, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane as his bad leg took his weight. He looked at Clara standing in the frosted grass. He looked at her thin cloak. He looked at the heavy, battered trunk resting by her feet. His jaw tightened. A muscle leaped in his cheek. "Where are you going, Miss Linfield?" he asked. His voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and commanding. "To the village, Your Grace," Clara said, her teeth beginning to chatter despite her best efforts to lock her jaw. "And then?" "To York." "To do what?" "Henrietta has undoubtedly refused you a reference. You will find no work as a governess." It wasn't a question. He understood the vicious mechanics of his own social class perfectly. Clara lifted her chin. "I will find work, Your Grace. I am not afraid of labor." Arthur stared at her. The wind whipped her dark hair around her pale face. She looked small, half-frozen, and entirely unyielding. "I have an estate 20 miles from here," Arthur said abruptly. "Westford Abbey. It has a library. My grandfather spent half his life acquiring antiquities, manuscripts, and ledgers from across Europe. He stacked them in a room for 40 years and then died. The place is a tomb of uncatalogued paper. It is rotting." Clara frowned, confused by the sudden change in topic. The wind bit through her cloak again, and she shivered violently. Arthur took a step closer. "I require an archivist, someone who understands Greek, Latin, and history. Someone with the discipline to bring order to chaos. I do not care about your character reference from a spiteful woman. I care about your father's ledgers." Clara stared at him. The sheer pragmatism of the offer stunned her. He wasn't offering charity. He wasn't rescuing a damsel. He was offering employment. Hard, tedious, isolating work. It was exactly what she needed. "I require a wage," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly from the cold. "And a room with a fire." "You will have £50 a year, your own quarters, and as much coal as you can burn," Arthur countered without hesitation. But you will work. I have no tolerance for idleness." "I have never been idle a day in my life, Your Grace." Arthur studied her face for a long second. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. He turned to his driver, who was watching the exchange from the box. "Bates, the lady's trunk. Strap it to the back." Before Clara could protest, Arthur reached out. He didn't take her hand. He grasped her elbow through her cloak, his grip firm and steadying, and guided her toward the open door of the warm carriage. "Get in, Miss Linfield," Arthur said. "You are freezing, and I have a profound dislike of standing in the wind." Westford Abbey did not look like a place where a duke lived. It looked like a fortress preparing for a siege. As the carriage rolled through the iron gates, Clara peered through the glass. There were no manicured lawns, no delicate fountains, no Greek statues dotting the landscape. The abbey was a massive, sprawling structure of dark grey stone, entirely devoid of ornamental frivolity. The woods pressed close to the house, wild and untamed. It felt heavy. It felt real. When they stopped at the front steps, there was no line of liveried footmen waiting to greet them. An older man in a plain black suit, the butler, Clara assumed, opened the heavy oak doors. A pair of massive hunting dogs immediately trotted out, sniffing at the cold air before pushing their wet noses into Arthur's hands. Arthur scratched them absent-mindedly behind the ears. He turned to Clara as she stepped down from the carriage. "Mr. Harrison," Arthur said to the butler, "this is Miss Linfield. She is the new archivist. Put her in the east wing, second floor. Have a fire lit immediately." Harrison bowed slightly, his face entirely impassive, betraying no surprise at his master returning with a half-frozen woman in a frayed grey dress. "Very good, Your Grace. Shall I send up a tray?" "Yes, meat, bread, and hot tea." Arthur turned to Clara. "Eat. Warm yourself. I will meet you in the library in 2 hours to show you the extent of the disaster you have agreed to manage." He didn't wait for her thanks. He turned and walked into the dark, cavernous hall, the dogs trailing at his heels, the rhythmic thump of his cane echoing off the stone walls. 2 hours later, Clara stood before a set of massive double doors on the ground floor. She had eaten ravenously. She had stood by the roaring fire in her new bedroom, a room larger and warmer than any she had occupied since her father died. She had brushed the dust of the road from her Sunday silk and pinned her hair back tightly. She pushed the doors open. The smell hit her first. It was the scent of dry paper, old leather bindings, and settling dust. For the scholar's daughter, it was the smell of home. She stepped inside and stopped dead. The room was vast. 2 stories high, ringed by a wrought-iron balcony, but it was in absolute ruin. Books were not neatly lined on shelves. They were stacked in precarious towers on the floor. Leather-bound manuscripts were piled haphazardly on tables. Rolls of parchment were stuffed into corners. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, allowing the pale winter light to illuminate millions of floating dust motes. In the center of the chaos stood a large oak desk. Behind it, stripped of his heavy coat and wearing only a white linen shirt and a dark waistcoat, stood the Duke of Westford. He was holding a crumbling leather journal, frowning at it. He looked up as Clara walked in. "My grandfather," Arthur said, tossing the journal onto the desk, "was a hoarder of history. He bought entire estates' worth of libraries from ruined Italian counts and French exiles. He shipped them here in crates, opened them, and simply left them." Clara walked slowly toward a towering stack of books near the door. She reached out, her fingers gently grazing the spine of a massive, leather-bound volume. She pulled her hand back, looking at the thick layer of dust on her fingertips. "It is a tragedy," Clara murmured. "It is a mess," Arthur corrected bluntly. He leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms. The casual posture highlighted the sheer breadth of his shoulders. "I tried to hire a man from Oxford last year. He lasted 3 days before complaining about the draft and the sheer volume of the work. He said it would take a decade to catalogue." "He was an amateur," Clara said. Arthur's eyebrows shot up. A flash of genuine surprise crossed his face, followed quickly by a grim smile. "Is that so? If you possess an understanding of categorization by era, region, and author, a room this size can be catalogued in 3 years. 4, if the manuscripts require preservation work." Clara stepped further into the room, her eyes darting over the chaotic piles, her mind already beginning to sort and structure. The anxiety of the morning was gone. In a room full of books, she was no longer a terrified governess. She was a master of her domain. She turned to look at him. "Where are the ledgers? I must establish a numbering system immediately." Arthur watched her. The tired, cynical lines around his eyes seemed to soften, just a fraction. He pushed himself off the desk and walked over to a heavy wooden cabinet. He opened it, revealing stacks of blank, bound ledgers and wooden boxes filled with fresh pens and ink. "Here," he said. Clara walked over to the cabinet. She stood beside him, acutely aware again of his height, and the quiet, imposing stillness he commanded. "Miss Linfield," Arthur said quietly, looking down at the blank books, "I did not bring you here to play a game of charity. I brought you here because I saw a woman at a dinner table who refused to break when the world demanded she shatter." Clara looked up at him. The distance between them was minimal. She could see the faint silver scars near his temple, the permanent exhaustion in his dark eyes. "And why does that matter to you, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Arthur looked away, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic, dusty tomb of his grandfather's obsession. "Because I spent 3 years watching men break," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I have no desire to surround myself with fragility anymore. I need people who know how to survive." He turned back to her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse hammer. "The library is yours, Miss Linfield. Fix it." He didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Clara alone in the dust. The silence, and the overwhelming realization that her life had irrevocably changed. Winter bled into a brutal, muddy spring, but inside the library of Westford Abbey, time was measured in leather bindings and ink spills. Clara did not stop moving for 3 months. She tied a heavy canvas apron over her new, practical wool skirts, rolled up her sleeves, and went to war against the decay. She ordered crates of beeswax to treat cracking spines. She hauled heavy iron buckets of coal to keep the damp out of the oldest vellum. Her hands, once pale and raw from the cold of the Roxbury nursery, grew calloused and permanently stained with black iron gall ink. She thrived. The fear of starvation, the gnawing anxiety of the invisible servant, vanished into the towering shelves. She catalogued 4,000 volumes by the time the first snowdrops pushed through the frozen mud outside. Arthur did not leave her to the silence. At first his visits were brief. He would stand in the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane, watching her sort through piles of crumbling correspondence. He asked sharp, practical questions about her progress. By the second month, he stopped standing in the doorway. He began taking his evening tea at the heavy oak desk while Clara worked by the fire. He brought ledgers of his own, estate accounts, tenant disputes, crop yields. They worked in companionable silence, accompanied only by the crackle of the hearth, the scratch of her quill, and the occasional thump of his boot when his bad leg cramped. They did not speak of the dinner party, they spoke of the work. "You are relentless," Arthur said one late evening in March. The rain was lashing against the tall windows. Clara was perched precariously on a rolling wooden ladder, struggling to wedge a massive, brass-bound atlas into a newly cleared gap on the top shelf. She paused, pushing a stray lock of dark hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint smudge of dust on her cheek. "A disorganized library is an insult to the people who wrote the books, Your Grace," she replied, shoving the heavy atlas home. It fit perfectly. She let out a small, satisfied breath. "Come down before you break your neck," Arthur said. He closed his ledger. "The books have survived 100 years of neglect. They will survive the night." Clara descended the ladder carefully. Her back ached, a dull, familiar throb. She walked over to the small table near the fire, where Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, had left a tray of cold roast beef and sharp cheese. Clara poured herself a cup of water, acutely aware of Arthur's eyes on her. He watched her with a steady, unreadable intensity. It was the gaze of a man accustomed to assessing battlefields, but the hostility that had marked his face at Henrietta's table was entirely gone. In its place was a quiet, heavy focus. "You have ink on your nose," he said. Clara frowned, reaching up to scrub at her face with her apron. "Is it gone?" "No, you have merely pushed it closer to your eye." Clara let her hand drop, a sudden flush of warmth rising to her cheeks. She looked at him. He was seated in the high-backed leather chair, the firelight catching the silver threads in his dark hair and the jagged white line of the scar at his temple. "You do not sleep, Your Grace," Clara noted quietly. It was a breach of etiquette, pointing out the master's failings, but the strict rules of society had eroded in the dust of the library. Arthur looked at the fire. "Sleep is a crowded place, Miss Linfield. The dead are very talkative." It was the most he had ever spoken of the peninsula. Clara set her cup down. She walked closer to the hearth, standing near his chair. She didn't offer pity. Pity was useless to a man like Arthur. "My father used to say that memory is a ghost we choose to feed," Clara said softly. "Perhaps you are feeding them too much." Arthur let out a harsh, dry laugh. "They earned their meals." He turned his head, looking up at her. The exhaustion in his eyes was absolute. "And what ghosts do you feed, Clara?" It was the first time he had used her given name. The syllables hung in the warm air, heavy and intimate. "The ghost of a life where I am powerless," she answered honestly. She looked down at her calloused, ink-stained hands. "I work so that I never have to sit at the end of a table and be laughed at again." Arthur reached out. He didn't hesitate. His large, rough hand closed over her wrist. His thumb brushed against the ink stain on her knuckles. The contact sent a sharp jolt of electricity straight up Clara's arm. "You will never sit at the end of a table again," Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying the weight of an ironclad vow. "Not in my house." He released her wrist, though the warmth of his grip lingered on her skin long after he turned back to the fire. April brought the thaw, and with it, the mud. It also brought the outside world, violently and without warning. Clara was in the East Wing corridors, carrying a stack of restored Greek plays back to the library. The Abbey was usually tomb quiet in the afternoon, save for the distant barking of the hounds. But today, the heavy thud of the front knocker echoed through the stone halls, followed by the frantic scurrying of footmen. Clara paused at the top of the grand staircase. The heavy oak doors were thrown wide open. A blast of wet spring wind swept into the foyer, carrying the distinct, shrill voice of a woman accustomed to making demands. "Take this cloak. It is ruined. Absolutely ruined. The roads in this God-forsaken county are a disgrace. Arthur, where is the Duke?" Clara froze. The stack of books suddenly felt like lead in her arms. Henrietta, the Duchess of Roxbury, stood in the centre of the foyer. She was flanked by her niece, Cecily, who looked pale and thoroughly mud-splattered. Behind them stood Viscount Althorp, a young, weak-chinned sycophant Henrietta often paraded around. Their carriage had clearly bogged down in the treacherous spring muck, forcing them to seek refuge at the nearest estate. Unfortunately for Clara, the nearest estate was Westford. Mr. Harrison the butler stood entirely unruffled by the aristocratic tantrum. "His Grace is currently in the lower paddocks, Your Grace. If you would care to wait in the drawing-room—" "I will not wait in a draughty drawing-room," Henrietta snapped, batting away a footman trying to take her ruined velvet cloak. "Have fires lit in the guest quarters. I require hot water, tea, and someone to scrape this filth from my boots." Henrietta turned sharply, intending to march towards the heat of the main house. As she pivoted, her eyes swept up the grand staircase. She stopped. Clara stood on the landing, wearing a plain grey wool dress, a dark canvas apron tied around her waist, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her hands were clutching a stack of books. The silence in the foyer was immediate and suffocating. Henrietta's eyes widened. For a moment, genuine shock registered on her harsh features. She had assumed Clara was dead in a ditch somewhere, or scrubbing floors in a workhouse. To find her here, standing on the grand staircase of Westford Abbey like she belonged, was an affront to Henrietta's entire worldview. The shock quickly dissolved into an ugly, triumphant sneer. "Well," Henrietta said, her voice dripping with venom, "I see the mystery of Westford's sudden departure has been solved. I had heard rumours, of course, but I refused to believe a duke would stoop so low." Cecily gasped softly, covering her mouth with a gloved hand. Viscount Althorp let out a low, mocking chuckle. Clara didn't move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a violent bird trapped in a cage. The old instincts screamed at her to lower her eyes, to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. "Be wallpaper." She gripped the books tighter. She thought of her father. She thought of the 4,000 volumes she had hauled, cleaned, and categorized. She thought of the firelight in the library. Clara lifted her chin. She looked down the stairs, meeting the Duchess's furious glare with cool, dead-eyed calm. "Good afternoon, Your Grace," Clara said. Her voice did not shake. Henrietta bristled. "Not address me, you little tramp. Drop those books and fetch the tea, and send for a proper maid to draw my bath. I will not have a ruined governess touching my things." "I am the archivist of Westford Abbey," Clara replied evenly, her voice projecting clearly into the cavernous space. "I do not fetch tea. Mr. Harrison will direct the kitchen staff to assist you." Henrietta turned a mottled, furious red. No one spoke to her like that. Certainly not the hired help. She took a step towards the stairs, her hands balling into fists. "You insolent wretch!" Henrietta hissed. "You think because you warm a duke's bed you have secured a station. You are nothing. He will tire of you. Men of his rank always tire of their whores. And when he throws you out, I will ensure no household in England takes you in. You will die in the gutter." Clara felt the colour drain from her face. The word echoed off the high stone ceiling. Whore. It was a filthy, heavy word, designed to strip away every ounce of dignity she had painstakingly rebuilt. She opened her mouth to reply, to defend her honour, to defend the entirely professional, desperately lonely reality of her life here. But a heavy, dragging footstep sounded behind Henrietta. Step, thump, step, thump. The heavy front doors, still partially open, revealed Arthur standing on the threshold. He was dressed in riding leathers, splattered with mud to his knees. He held a riding crop in his right hand, his heavy silver cane in his left. His hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain. He looked like a man who had just walked off a battlefield. He had heard the Duchess. The entire foyer had heard the Duchess. Arthur's face was an absolute mask of cold, terrifying fury. Henrietta spun around, the anger draining from her face, replaced instantly by panic. "Arthur, our carriage!" "Get out!" The two words were spoken quietly, but they hit the room like a physical blow. Henrietta gaped at him. "Arthur, be reasonable. The mud is axle deep," I said. Arthur stepped into the foyer, his dark eyes fixed on the Duchess with a murderous intensity. "Get out! You cannot throw me out into the rain!" Henrietta shrieked, her aristocratic composure entirely shattering. "I am a Duchess! You would evict me for the sake of a—" Arthur moved faster than his limp should have allowed. He crossed the foyer, raising his cane slightly, stopping inches from Henrietta. The Duchess flinched backward, nearly colliding with Viscount Althorpe. "Do not finish that sentence," Arthur snarled, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "If you insult her again in my house, I will not throw you out. I will have Harrison drag you by your hair to the property line. Do you understand me?" Cecily began to cry. The Viscount backed away, his hands raised in surrender. Henrietta stared at the Duke, trembling with rage and humiliation. She looked up at Clara on the stairs, then back to Arthur. "You are mad. Society will shun you for this. You are throwing away your peers for a beggar." "My peers?" Arthur sneered. "Are cowards and parasites. Miss Linfield is worth 1,000 of you. Harrison." The butler stepped forward smoothly. "Yes, Your Grace." "Put the Duchess and her party back into their carriage. If their horses cannot pull it, harness my draft horses. Get them off my land." Arthur didn't wait to see the order carried out. He turned his back on Henrietta, walked past the weeping Cecily, and began to climb the grand staircase. Henrietta screamed obscenities as the footman advanced on her, but Arthur ignored the noise. He walked up the steps, his limp heavily pronounced, his eyes locked on Clara. Clara stood frozen on the landing. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to press the heavy books against her chest to keep from dropping them. Arthur reached the landing. He stopped in front of her. The smell of rain, leather, and wet earth clung to him. He looked at her pale face, at the tremor in her hands. "Are you harmed?" he asked quietly, the rage evaporating from his voice, leaving only a deep, rough concern. "No," Clara whispered. Arthur reached out and took the heavy stack of books from her arms. He set them carelessly on a nearby mahogany table. Then he looked at her. "Come with me," he said. He led her into his private study, a dark, oak-panelled room off the main corridor. He shut the heavy door behind them, cutting off the distant, fading sounds of Henrietta being forcibly evicted from the abbey. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the adrenaline of the confrontation. Clara stood by the massive desk. The shock was wearing off, and the reality of what had just happened was sinking in. Arthur had just irrevocably alienated one of the most powerful families in England. He had made himself a social pariah. "You shouldn't have done that," Clara said, her voice cracking. "She will ruin your name in London. The gossip—" "To hell with London," Arthur interrupted harshly. He walked to the sideboard, poured a measure of brandy into a glass, and drank it in one swift motion. He set the glass down hard. "Do you think I care what people who do nothing but talk say about me?" "I care!" Clara said, the frustration and fear suddenly spilling over. "I care that they look at me and see nothing but dirt. I care that no matter how many books I read, how hard I work, I will only ever be a punchline to them." She turned away from him, gripping the edge of the desk, fighting the sudden, humiliating sting of tears. She had built a fortress here in the library, and Henrietta had smashed through it in seconds, reminding Clara of exactly where she belonged in the eyes of the world. Arthur walked up behind her. He didn't touch her, but she felt his heat, his overwhelming presence. "Then let them laugh," Arthur said, his voice dropping low, rough and absolute. "Let them laugh from their sinking estates while they drown in debt and vanity. They do not know you. They do not know the strength it takes to survive them." Clara closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a clean trail through the faint dusting of soot. "She called me a whore. She thinks you keep me here out of pity, or use." "I do not pity you, Clara," Arthur said. He stepped around her, placing himself between her and the desk. He reached out, his large hands gently gripping her shoulders. He looked down into her face, his dark eyes stripping away every defense she had left. "I pity the men who walked past you without seeing you. I pity the fools who thought a grey dress could hide the fiercest mind I have ever encountered." Arthur's thumbs brushed against her collarbones. "I did not bring you to Westford Abbey to organize my books. I brought you here because the moment you sat beside me at that table, the world finally felt real." Clara looked up at him. Her breath hitched. There were no flowery declarations. There was no poetry. There was only the brutal, grounded truth of a man who had lost everything, finding the one thing he wanted to keep. "Arthur," she whispered. "I am a damaged man, Clara," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "My leg is ruined. My purr is foul. The ghosts are loud. I cannot offer you the polished life of a society wife. I can only offer you this stone fortress, a library of dust, and my absolute, unyielding loyalty." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Stay with me," Arthur murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as an archivist, not as an employee. Stay as my equal. Marry me." Clara stared into the eyes of the Duke of Westford. She thought of the cold nursery in Yorkshire. She thought of the fear. She looked at the man who had seen through her invisibility, who had handed her a chair, a glass of wine, and the right to exist. She reached up. Her ink-stained fingers traced the rough line of his jaw, resting against the scar at his temple. "I am not afraid of ghosts, Arthur," Clara said softly, a fierce, undeniable smile finally breaking across her face. "And I am exceedingly good at bringing order to chaos." Arthur let out a breath that sounded like a ragged prayer. He leaned down, his hand sliding from her shoulders to frame her face, and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was deep, desperate, and entirely grounding. It was the collision of two survivors realizing they no longer had to fight alone. Clara wound her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the solid, unyielding reality of him. Outside, the spring rain washed the carriage tracks away, dissolving the mud and the memories of the people who had tried to break them. Inside the stone walls of Westford Abbey, the Duke and his Duchess finally found their home. If you loved this story of Clara and Arthur, two survivors finding power and love in a world designed to break them, please hit the like button. It helps us bring more deeply human, grounded historical dramas to life. Share this video with someone who loves a romance built on mutual respect, fierce intelligence, and sweet revenge against toxic society. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next full-length storytelling experience. What was your favorite moment? Let us know in the comments below.